It's my pleasure to introduce you now to Naeem Mohaiemen, who will be chairing this evening's lecture by Shahidul Alam. Mohaiemen researches socialist utopias, malleable borders, and fragile families. Historian Afsan Chaudhry calls the work of Mohaiemen, Dina Siddiqui, Bina de Costa, Nayanika Mukherjee, and Yasmin Sekia as a secondary wave of history writing about Bangladesh. He is Associate Professor of Visual Arts at Columbia University, New York. A few technical points about this evening's event. We request you to keep your audio and video off and would also like to inform you that this session is being recorded. The lecture will be for 45 minutes and there will be a discussion and Q&A of 45 minutes. We request you to type your questions or comments in the chat box during as well as after the discussion, which Naeem will be taking as they come in. I will now hand over to Naeem to introduce Shahidul and to commence the program. Over to Naeem.
Thank you, Gayatri. Thank you for the introduction. Fantastic to get to know the work of the winner of the prize. It's my role here to both introduce Shahidul Alam and then to moderate the questions, the discussion afterwards. And his biography has been shared in the chat window already, and his biography is quite well known to many people, of course, working in South Asian photography. So I thought that for my introduction, I might focus on one particular aspect that I think is really worth highlighting, which is that Shahidul Alam, as an institution builder, has often put other people's photography first before his own. And there's the arc that you can follow of the time when he was making his own photographs and when he started building institutions. And that arc is quite extraordinary because to build these institutions requires actually putting other people's work in the front. So rather than reading the traditional biography, I took permission from the organizers to share some screens from a project I had done a couple of years back, actually as part of Chobi Mela, the photography festival that Shahidul Alam founded. And it's a project we did, which is a timeline that simultaneously talks about Chobi Mela, this photography festival, the organizations that Shahidul Alam had been involved with within Bangladesh, and all the other parallel organizations that came up at the same time, as well as the change in technology. And it will give a sense of what else was going on at the same time and what's the ecology within which Shahidul Alam's work exists. So this is a project called What Was Chobi Mela and What Happens Next. It's a play on the famous book, What Was Socialism and What Happens Next. And it started, the timeline started in 1989, goes all the way up to the year of that festival. And it starts from the well-known transition point in Bangladeshi photography, the point when Shahidul Alam has returned from abroad, started working in Bangladesh, was a member of Bangladesh Photographic Society, and then leaves Bangladesh Photographic Society to start Brick Picture Library, which is the beginning of a certain kind of photography journey. And I'm just going to focus on the items that are highlighted in pink, which are key moments in this transition. World press photography comes to Bangladesh at the initiative of Drake, and it becomes a certain kind of international linkage, the beginning of a certain international linkage for Bangladeshi photography scene. Out of Focus, which is a children's photography group, which Shahidul Alam will talk about, is the beginning of a questioning of the Bangladeshi photography scene of themselves, because at the beginning, there's a conversation about, well, rather than Western photographers presenting our images, we should be presenting our images. Is the time when the question of what is our starts being challenged by Shahidul Alam and others. And so this becomes the beginning of even shifting the ground away from middle-class photographers to the children of Out of Focus, which Alam will speak about. Drake Pathshala School, a very significant organization, not just for Bangladesh, for all of South Asia, begins in 1998. And as we heard, Prakash Bhuiya, this year's winner of the prize, is actually a student of Pathshala. Drick launches the Majority World Photography Agency in 2004, another significant intervention, and some sort of parallel perhaps with the founding of an organization like Magnum Photo after World War II. And then I just want to highlight this moment between 2017 and 2019, which also connects with the theme of Dissenting with Grace, the title of Shahidul Alam's presentation today. In 2017, Pathshala has its 200th batch of basic photography class, and 2 years later, it actually begins to be able to grant degrees for the first time under Dhaka University. It's a very significant journey in an institutional recognition of photography, spearheaded by Shahidul Alam and his team. But it's exactly a year after Shahidul Alam is arrested and jailed for 107 days for his online reporting on the student protests, which we'll also hear about. And it's a moment of dualism between elements of the Bangladesh state reacting with fear to Shahidul Alam's statements and deciding to corral him in jail. And at the same time, another kind of institution deciding that what Pathshala does is important enough to be granted a bachelor's degree. And this dualism with the state, with institutions, has been, I think, the journey of Bangladeshi photography and Shahidul Alam throughout. So I'll just stop there and turn it over to Shahidul Alam to hear his presentation, his talk, Dissenting with Grace. Alam bhai, over to you.
Thanks, Naeem. Incidentally, the timeline that you're talking about is currently being shown at the Wrightwood Gallery in Chicago, where you and your colleagues are amongst 33 other artists who are presented. So I'll go back. Now, the 1971 War of Liberation had left us with a wrecked nation, but we were full of hope. We wanted to prepare ourselves for taking this new nation forward. My sister, being in Liverpool, provided an opportunity. My middle-class parents, they were professionals, but not wealthy, but they were able to rustle up a ticket, a one-way ticket to London. Upon arriving, I was able to get myself a scholarship at Liverpool Institute, and later cleaning toilets, working at building sites, garages, nightclubs, helping graduate in biochemistry and genetics. I went on to do a PhD in organic chemistry. That's when I got involved with the Socialist Workers' Party, seeing how they used photography in the campaigns and their rallies convinced me that back home, I could probably do more as a photojournalist than as a research chemist. This image of Nur Hussain, it's at Jahangirnagar University, relates to that period that Naeem talks about. I returned to Bangladesh, having been away for higher studies, and I discover that an autocratic general has taken over this liberated nation of ours. Nur Hussain was a young man who had painted on his back, "Let democracy be freed." There was a huge campaign by the opposition. They'd all gathered together to lay siege to Dhaka city on the 10th of November, 1987. That's when Nur Hussain in Bolton came out with his bare back, having those words, "Let democracy be freed." He was killed by the police that day. I went on to photograph the struggle for democracy in a broader context. My documentation of the resistance included the plight of ordinary people. In 1970, there'd been a huge cyclone in Bhola where a huge number of people had died. And one of our concerns, one of the reasons for our anger was that the Pakistani government, who were ruling at that time, didn't seem to care about our plight. Here in 1988, in what was perhaps the worst floods in a century, again, the government didn't really seem to care. Sadly, the opposition didn't care too much either. The plight of the people was less of a concern than their need for power. Anyway, the work went on, and I then, in 1989, the year RIC was set up, I was stupefied by this incredibly opulent wedding. Mind you, I must point out that there have been far more opulent weddings since, but at that time, this was a wedding one could not imagine. At a time when the nation was recovering from this horrendous floods, It was taking place in a stadium called Abahuni, a playfield called Abahuni. The wall of the stadium was broken, so the red carpet could flow directly from the president's Cadillac to the wedding dais. The who's who of Bangladesh was there, but not a word was spoken. No one bothered to mention that this wedding was taking place at a time when this nation was reeling under these floods. Incidentally, the minister's daughter, the minister whose daughter's wedding it was also a media magnet. So the media was very much part of the story. I continued to tell pictures. I mean, this was a show I tried to put together on the 10th of November 1989 as an homage to Nur Hussain, because that was the day, it was remembering the day he'd been killed. And predictably, no one was prepared to show this work. At that time, we didn't really have independent galleries as such. They were mostly in cultural organizations or government galleries. And there was, I think, one private gallery, La Gallery, in the sort of wealthy part of town. But no one was interested in touching this work. The Alias Française was going to sponsor this. Incidentally, 1989 is the bicentenary of the French Revolution. But once they looked at this work, they said, no way are we touching it. So I carried on trying to address the inequalities. Some of the things I failed to do, I would like to do later, and I've tried to address later on. This was a picture of the wicker basket, was a picture I took again in Jinjira in 1988. What I failed to do was to compare this picture for the picture of these kids in the minister's home watching television. You can tell what time it is. None of them have mobile phones. And there's an interesting story about this little girl in the front, but if I have time, I'll talk about it later. I failed to compare it with the lifestyle of the minister's home. Later, and I will talk about that again, I was able to observe those inequalities in my own home. But this image of the woman casting the vote in a makeshift voting booth was, for me, very significant. She, in my mind, was avenging Nur Hussain's death. But what had happened in between, I'd started this work as an activist in the streets, taking pictures of my own movement, and we were able to bring the general down. But I soon realized that an election or a democratically elected government doesn't in itself lead to democracy. And you in India will know this very well. In our case, we've lost the right to vote as well, but that's another story. Coming back to what Naeem was talking about, I mean, we had set up DRIC in 1989 with the idea that it would be a platform for local storytellers, that we would tell our stories, and that our identity would not be based on what visiting Western photographers regurgitated through their stereotypes. So we began to question our own position. I, as a male middle-class photographer, within that power structure, held control that was not in some ways too different from that of the white Western photographer. The woman who didn't have a door to shut on my face, whom I was photographing, was as distant from me in terms of power as perhaps the white Western photographer would have been in my place. So we started a women's collective called Onno Chokhe Dekha, and this group produced very interesting work. We didn't at that time have the role models, so we invited Paulami Desai, a British woman photographer from Asian origin, to come over and work with our women, and they produced beautiful work, powerful work, searching work, provocative work, and that work was shown at Shilpakala Academy, our Academy of Fine and Performing Arts. It toured Britain, it was featured by Autograph, and it was actually done as a partnership with the agency Autograph in Britain, which represented a similar struggle in Britain where of racial inequality. And So autograph represented photographers of color, whereas we were looking at photographers of the majority world, and particularly Bangladesh. So autograph taught this work. We showed at the Shilpakala Academy, as I mentioned. But again, Naeem and his timeline had spoken about World Press Photo. We brought World Press Photo for the first time to Bangladesh in 1993. As you can see from the poster, I mean, now we have these glitzy posters. Those times we used to do it in a much more ad hoc and simple way. This opening was on the rooftop of the rig with a little shamiana on the top. What's very interesting are the two people on the right. The person behind the mic is Dr. Badruddin Chaudhary, who later became the president of Bangladesh. He was then the deputy leader of BNP, the opposition party. The gentleman on the right, Abdus Samad Azad, was the foreign minister and the deputy leader of the Army League. We thought this would be an opportunity to ask the opposing political parties to get together and actually demonstrate that they were actually more interested in nation building and were prepared to overcome their petty rivalries to work together for the bigger story. And they agreed. They came on board. They cut the ribbon together. They chatted. Drake at that time was in my parents' home, and they sat in the drawing room chatting to the media, talking about how they were really friends and how they had a cup of coffee together and things like that. But incidentally, that was the only time in the history of Bangladesh that we've actually been able to get the two political rivals to do anything together. World Press is coming back to Bangladesh in 2023, 30 years after I tried to get them to become more global. And we have to see whether we can ever repeat that. But I started mentoring young photographers. And the two girls here, Rabia Sharkar Rima on the left and Molly Akhtar on the right, were amongst a group of 10 kids, 5 boys and 5 girls of working class background, when we started training. Again, the idea was that middle class male photographers could not be the only people to tell our story. They've gone on to become successful professionals themselves. Molly now is a senior editor at Channel I, one of the leading television channels. The group is called Out of Focus, and that name was drawn from the famous group F64, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, and the others who believed in this sharp focus. And we deliberately played on that because these were people who were out of focus in social terms. When I began working with them, I showed them this picture by Aziz Ibrahim Pugh, one of the students of the first batch of Patshala. Sadly, he's passed away. So this was a picture of a fire that had taken place in a garment factory. And Molly looks at this picture and she goes, "Oh, that's a fire in number 10. What happened in number 10? What's there to say?" she says. "The owner took the bodies and dumped them in the drain at night." What happened to the owner? Nothing ever happens to owners, she says. Waits a bit and goes, "If I had a camera, I'd take his picture. I'd put that guy in jail." Now, I'm a photojournalist. I take pictures. We try to think that our pictures make a difference, but we know that to a large extent, our pictures do not have the impact we like them to have. But the fact that this 10-year-old girl believed that with a camera she could right a wrong was very powerful for us. It sort of gave us the inspiration to carry on. And children actually have been my inspiration throughout my career. We then also took on technology. As Naeem mentioned in his timeline, we introduced email to Bangladesh. We didn't have an international telephone line. We didn't have a fax. And we thought this technology would help us connect. And one of the things we also did through this technology was to develop a South-South network globally. So we were able to connect with media practitioners and activists in Latin America, in Africa, in Bangladesh. We also produced a fax gateway, so people in rural Bangladesh could use our gateway to send faxes globally and things like that. But this picture is of Taslima Nasreen, the feminist writer, and there was a fatwa, and she was actually hiding in our flat. And we were able to use this technology to contact Article 19, PEN, Amnesty, etc. And eventually that helped her, help the release of Taslima. But this is a time when I also start curating and addressing other issues. I mean, HIV and AIDS then was a big story, but there was huge stigma associated with HIV and AIDS. So you would have these billboards with skeletons and, you know, horror pictures, and the stigma that HIV and AIDS had was something we were concerned about. So I started curating a show. Well, actually, it had begun in Britain, called Positive Lives. At that time, it was just by photographers from an agency called Network. And I decided to curate the South Asian chapter, expand the work to South Asia. And I commissioned Dainita Singh in India, Mike Abrahams, another Network photographer, to do stories in India. I did the stories in Bangladesh. And this picture is of sex workers whose beat was the House of Parliament in Bangladesh. And I'll come back to the woman sitting, leaning back and laughing, Hajara Begum, who has become a very dear friend, and we've stayed friends ever since. We've actually stayed friends with several of them, but I'll come back to Hajara later. But at that time, this was the first time we showed pictures of taboo subjects, of sex workers, of gay people. And this was a show at the Drake Gallery. And for the gay community, this was a coming out of sorts that they'd never done before. And if I get time, I'll talk about that later. So this is 96. In 98, I set up Pathshala, because, you know, if you have to fight, you need warriors. And I, you know, of course, had been mentoring photographers within Drake earlier on, but Pathshala provided a more structured education. This picture was taken by Taslima Akhtar, who's also a very leading activist in the garment movement. This iconic image of hers was Time Magazine's Picture of the Year, and, you know, has been seen worldwide. She now teaches at Pathshala. Assad, his picture of the Rohingya refugees was on the cover of National Geographic, the first time a Bangladeshi photographer's work featured on the cover of National Geographic. Now, this is interesting. It's happening at a time when photography really has not, up till then, been highly regarded, and the art community didn't consider photography to be art. At that time, the Asian Biennale's rules prevented photography and video from being entered because it was not art. I, at that time, began to do another type of work. I started looking much more regionally, looking at geopolitical issues, looking at environmental issues. And this picture of the red sail is quite well known. I will come back to this picture later. Remember this, it'll come back later in my talk. But what I talked about was how China, India, Bangladesh were connected through this river, how people's lives were inextricably linked through nature, through this river. In 2000, I set up Chobi Mela, the first festival of photography in Asia. Again, there is a story behind it. I might come back to that. But an important part of Chobi Mela was, while we showed very high quality work in, you know, white cube spaces, we also took on unusual spaces which would never have been considered for galleries. Earlier on, when I had a show at the Goethe Institute, many people, subaltern people who I'd invited, had never come to the show because they felt they wouldn't be let in. And that stayed with me. So when we did Chobi Mela, we ensured that if people were not going to go to the gallery would go to the people. So we have these mobile shows, which have now become very, very popular. And we've done them on boats, we've done them on tuk-tuks, we've done them on bullock carts, and They are the most popular part of Chobi Mela, and really we get far greater viewership through these than we do through our White Cube spaces. We also, in 2024, we set up Majority World. The term Majority World was something I began to introduce in the early 90s. Now it has moved into mainstream media, but I wanted to define us, and we were called Third World, the developing world. You know, we were defined by what we did not have. I wanted to challenge the Western hypocrisy when they talk about democracy, the fact that we happen to be the majority of humankind and are very rarely part of the decision-making process was something I wanted to bring up. So the agency was set up, and it was the first agency, as far as we know, which represented underrepresented photographers worldwide in Latin America and Africa, of course, in other parts of Asia. In 2009, we did a show on Tibetans in exile, and the Chinese government, which is very influential in our region, leaned on the Bangladesh government, which leaned on us, and they closed down our show. So we had riot police surrounding our gallery, and Professor Muzaffar Ahmed sitting there, who was then the head of Transparency International, is here surrounded by this police. And this photograph was also taken by a Pachola student, Andrew Biraj. And for me, it visually talks about this relationship between a state and its people. They stopped our show, but we learned through it. So the following year, in 2010, we did two things. We began a campaign called No More. As the name suggests, we wanted to highlight things which we should not tolerate. And I put together a story on extrajudicial killings, which in Bangladesh is called crossfire. In India, you call them encounters. And I also began to produce a different type of work, much more conceptual. I mean, for a start, the Rapid Action Battalion, who were responsible for the killings, were not going to invite me over to take pictures of people as they were killing them. But more importantly, I felt that showing bodies was not going to add to the debate. So what I decided to do was to create images based on what the dying people might have seen in the last moments of their lives. So this picture of the paddy field was where the body had been found. And people talked about how the paddy field was pristine, except where their body was. They talked about how the shirt he was wearing had a single bullet hole, but the body had multiple bullet holes. And the story begins to unravel. But these were images which were all lit by torchlight. Because when I spoke to the family members, they talked of how torches being shone on their face was their first encounter with the Rapid Action Battalion. All the killings were done in the dead of night, so all the pictures were taken also had those signs. So this is ambient light and torchlight, and all the pictures were taken there. Predictably, the government closed down the show. The riot police came again, but this time we were prepared. We'd done our homework. Moishita Devi, the famous activist and literature from India, came over to open the show. So we informed the media in advance. We live streamed the opening in the street outside our gallery. Didi was there. Nurul Kabir, in my mind, the bravest and most outspoken journalist and editor in the country, was also at the opening. This event went viral. It was on every major television channel. It was on the ticker tape. It was on the headlines of newspapers. New York Times made it a headline picture at that end. So it was a global thing, and the government didn't know how the hell to deal with this. Didi symbolically opened the show by unhandcuffing me. Now, I didn't at that time realize how significant these handcuffs were going to be, but that was how we did it. And while this is happening, I actually go inside the gallery, and it's surrounded by riot police, but we arranged for a backdoor entrance. I go into the gallery, and I'm doing a gallery walk on Skype with Alain Julien, the Secretary General of Reporters Sans Frontières. And this gallery walk is taking place while this gallery is surrounded by armed police. The government didn't know what the hell to do with us. We also took the government to court. They shut down the gallery, but we knew they didn't have a legal basis to do so. That was a time when the court was still prepared to take decisions against the government. They could follow the rule of law. That's no longer true, sadly. But at that time, they were going to rule against the government, and the government pulled back, and we had the show for one day, the last day of the show, because there was another show scheduled after that. But we weren't satisfied with that. We knew that the foreign minister, Deepu Mani, the woman in the green sari, was going to open the next show. So we lined up the corridor with the images that her government had prevented the public from seeing. And she had to walk through this, smiling at the media, but gritting her teeth while this was happening. And this is this tongue-in-cheek way in which we've done it all the way through. You know, that has remained the way we continue to work. But there have been other things as well. I talked about Hajira, the sex worker that has a parliament. This is Hajira. Many years later, we continue to be very dear friends. She said she wanted to set up a shelter for children of other sex workers. Hajira had had a very difficult life. She had been gang raped as a child. She'd lost the ability to bear children herself, and you know, her horrendous story. But she was not bitter. She decided she would do something with her life where she could make a difference. And this is in Adabor, where she set up this little home. And currently, we're trying to set up, build a house for her, buy some land for her, because what she's doing is quite incredible. Other movements continued. We were also looking at Western hegemony. The Guimet Museum in Paris was going to do a show of Bangladeshi heritage, collect some of the finest artifacts from different museums. We were very happy about this. We wanted the show to take place, but then we discovered that none of this was being seriously documented. So they had, for instance, a collection of very rare coins, and the documentation simply said 50 coins. We thought there's a problem here. So we started protesting, and you know, this is Rehnuma, my partner, and I in the streets. Nisar Ahmed at the back from the art college, who also played a role, is there. We parked ourselves outside the National Museum, but the government, using Eid as the way, when there are not that many people, brought in these trucks and whisked the work away to the airport. We were able to resist regardless, and eventually some of the work came back. Not all of it has been accounted for. But I continued working, and this is as the political campaigns continue, as the inter-party struggles continue. I'm in the streets along with my colleagues documenting these stories, and the struggle for democracy is an ongoing story that I do. We started something else. I mean, one of the things I was very conscious about was how mainstream media really ignored rural Bangladesh. We were also aware that technology was creating opportunities that had not been available before. So we set up, through Drick News, a news entity we'd set up, the Rural Visual Journalism Network. And our idea was that we would equip our journalists with equipment worth less than $300. So we took the iPod Touch, tripod, headphones, and a label microphone. And with that, these journalists went over reporting stories about rural Bangladesh. That is something that had never happened before. And these stories became important. We taught them to edit the material using iMovie on the iPod Touch. So they sent us edited movies, 3 to 5 minutes, which they produced in rural Bangladesh. And we linked up with Deutsche Welle, who published the work internationally, and we were able to get money back for these rural journalists to continue their work. We have been very active. The No More campaign continued, and we were really up in arms when the Tazreen fashion fire took place. And we decided we would use the the forum that the garment industry was familiar with, the billboard that the fashion industry used as our way of protest. And this billboard was set up in front of the building that belongs to the Garment Owners Association. The building, by the way, a 15-story building, had gone up without any planning permission. One prime minister had inaugurated the land, which was built on land they were not allowed to use because it was on a protected water body. Another prime minister inaugurated the building, and it was a 15-story building. It went up without planning permission. Anyway, we had this protest. We put up this huge banner in front of the building, and the government responded by sending riot police. Now, I mean, through all the talk, you might get an idea that our government does not respond to art, isn't appreciative of arts, ignores the art. That's far from the truth. I mean, as this picture will tell you, how many of us, how many artists have had this sort of a response to their artwork? But this is how this was done. And, you know, Naeem alluded to the fact that we have this relationship with the government where we're producing work which is powerful and important, which they cannot ignore, but we also work with the government. By this time, Chobi Mela had become the most important art event in the country. And we decided it was time to invite the government. So we invited the president of Bangladesh, Abdul Hamid, to inaugurate Chobi Mela, and he agreed. And this picture is taken in 2015, shortly before I'm being given the Shilpakala Award, the highest award given for culture to Bangladeshi artists. And this picture of me having a tete-a-tete with the president sort of questions the government version of me being state enemy number one. Of course, I used other things as well. The kafir on my head is one I was wearing. I knew the president would be there, the media attention would be on us. So I put on that kafir because that was the time when Israel was bombing Gaza, and I wanted to protest about that. So we've used every tool that works at any particular point. Whatever tools of resistance that exist, essentially. The relationship with India was a problematic thing for us, and I wrote this poem and put up this poster, made this poster and circulated it because I was very concerned. I mean, we're very grateful to India for the role that they played in 1971, but the fact that India has become the United States of South Asia is a huge problem for us. The bullying that is being done by India, and of course, you know, the recent laws that have been taken up or are attempting to be pushed through. So I wrote this. It was also in response to the fact that Abrar Fahad, a student of a university student in Bangladesh who had been critical of Modi's visit to Bangladesh, was brutally pummeled to death at the university in one of the torture cells that every public university in Bangladesh has. He was killed because he'd questioned Indian hegemony. Now, we were also looking at the politics of space. My work had been shown in synagogues, in churches, in temples. I'd never shown work in a mosque. And there is a conservative element to Islam, and there are people who consider photography to be haram. And I decided I would try and produce work which would address both conservativeness in Islam, but also Islamophobia, both of which I found problematic. Now, it was not going to be so easy to show work in a mosque, but I was able to convince a very beautiful mosque designed by Marina Tabassum. The land was donated by her grandmother, and I felt it was befitting that, you know, a woman architect, land being given by her grandmother, had designed this mosque. And I spoke to the mosque committee and told them that I wanted to return their mosque to the way the Prophet had intended it to be, because the Prophet's mosque in Medina was much more than a place of prayer. It was an education center. It performed as a hospital. It was a community center. He sheltered women there. He received state dignitaries. There was a an artist group from Abyssinia who wanted to perform, and they approached the Prophet to say, where can we perform? And he said, perform in my mosque. It was the first, perhaps, exhibition space or gallery. So this was a powerful argument, and that allowed me the opportunity to show this work in this mosque. When we were trying to show it, suddenly the local political mafia objected because we were stealing their thunder. So we decided that we would show it in the grounds of the mosque instead of the mosque itself. But then the kids came, the women came, and they loved the work, and they said, why is it not inside the mosque? You tell me. So the community took the work back into the mosque, which is where it was eventually shown. And this was the first time many people who'd never entered a mosque before came to this mosque. And it remains until now the only time a photographic exhibition has been shown in a mosque in Bangladesh. But since we've had requests by other mosques to show it, so we are opening a door. So that was in 2017. Later in 2017, on the 25th of August, the Rohingya mass exodus begins. I'd been photographing the Rohingyas for a long time, and many people are not aware that this is not a story of today. It's been going on for many, many years. But of course, in 2017, when it happened, that story needed to be told. And I traveled on a boat where the Rohingyas were. So this picture is actually on a boat in which the Rohingyas are going to Teknaf. Now, there are people who talk about how photographers should be non-interventionist, how they need to be aloof, how they must not in any way interfere with the stories. I'm not of that opinion. I'm a citizen and a human being first, a photographer afterwards. And the reason I take pictures is because I care about the issues that are being told about. And on this boat, the woman with the yellow scarf over her head, with the kid in the green, she was visibly tired. She'd been carrying this child for a long time. So I took the kid, and the rest of the journey, I was not taking pictures. I was looking after the kid. The picture was taken by Shahnawaz, a student I've mentored. So thank you, Shahnawaz. But I'm moving on to the environmental stories I was talking about. This next picture of the tear gas is of protests that were taking place by environmentalists who were protesting about the fact that a coal-powered plant, electricity plant was being set up very close to the Sundarbans, a natural history, a UNESCO heritage site, and one of the few places where we still have forest left. So, of course, the government responded as they do with tear gas and batons. And a couple of these activists were picked up by the police and taken into Shabak Thana. I sneak into the Thana, and I'm able to take these pictures and transmit them before the police can work out what's going on. So that's the sort of way in which we've been working. So I'll move on now to 2019. On the 29th of July, 2019, there had been a road accident, and Rajib and Mim, two young students, were mowed down by a bus, which actually went over the footpath where they had been standing and killed them and injured many others. Now, this led to huge protests by students, and understandably, because it wasn't simply the fact that there'd been a road accident, really it's bad in itself, but the fact that people in general, and students in particular, recognized that the government did not really have serious intent. They were not addressing these issues or many of these other issues that had become burning issues in my country. So the students took to the streets. They put up signs like, "We want justice," but they also put up signs saying, "We're repairing a failed state." And that is what they were doing. They ran the streets efficiently. When the entire state machinery failed to do that, They allowed ambulances to go through and stopped VIP cars and checked to see if they had licenses, which most of them didn't. This was hugely popular. People came into the streets. They brought food for the students, and the students had huge support. This became a major embarrassment for the government. They initially tried to negotiate with them, but when that didn't work, they then turned their armed hoodlums onto the kids. So, and I was documenting this. So this is a picture I took from a rooftop. You see these machetes with people with helmets being supported by the police. So I have video footage of the police standing by as these people attack these students. So on the 4th of August, I was doing live feeds on Facebook and reporting. I got attacked. My equipment got smashed. I got roughed up, but I continued reporting. And on the 5th, I'm again telling these stories and doing live feeds. That day, I took time out to do an interview for Al Jazeera, came back to take pictures, went back home to upload the pictures. And that's when, you know, the doorbell rang. I was the only person in the house. And these burly men came in. I know what happens in my country. I live in Bangladesh. So this nation that talks about freedom of speech, which is enshrined in our constitution, certainly doesn't believe in it itself. So they tried to make a deal with me. They said I was tortured that night. I was later taken to court. But in between, the high police officials came up and said, look, we'll forget all this. You go back home, nothing happens, everything's deleted from the records, but you stay quiet. And that was a price I was not prepared to pay for my freedom. So I'm taken to court. This is a picture taken by another student of mine, Shubro Kantidash, while I'm being taken to court, and you can see what sort of freedom of press we have. But it actually resulted in a global campaign. So Naeem, who's chairing this event, and many others across the globe campaigned for my release. The bravest were the people in Bangladesh itself, who took far greater risks to do that. Over a Nobel laureates campaigned for my freedom. Some I knew, like Desmond Tutu and Professor Yunus and Marina Mahathir, Sharon Stone and others. But some of these people I had no connection with. I mean, I'd never in a million years thought I'd have any link with, business people, Richard Branson and other people, for instance. But they all actually combined and campaigned for my freedom. The government turned down my bail 5 times, and eventually, after pressure from the European Union, released me on the 20th of November. Prior to this, in I think it was July 2018, I'd gone over to Delhi to talk to Arundhati Roy to convince her that she must come to Chobi Mela, and she happily agreed. Of course, this happened in between, in August. So it's while I'm in jail, we decided we would go ahead. So the other curators of Chobi Mela came, visited me in jail. We didn't know if I was going to come out of jail, or certainly when I might come out of jail. But we decided we would hold Chobi Mela anyway. So Arundhati came over, and the government tried to close that one down, and that led to another set of protests, and the government really didn't know what the hell to do. I was also being critical of media itself. So the Digital Security Act, which is a draconian law that suppresses media freedom and many other things, it was something that the media of Bangladesh was critical of until the Prime Minister gave a fairly hefty donation to the Journalist Welfare Fund. And after that, these images of the Prime Minister dangled from the press club in Bangladesh, whereas the new building we were setting up in Dhrik had the Free Assange poster, which no other journalist, certainly mainstream media in Bangladesh was not interested in. But through this, we were also questioning the very people who'd supported me, in the sense that their rhetoric about freedom and democracy stops when dissent gets close to home. And this image is something we use in the back of our visiting card. We built this building in between. And all of this continued while I was in jail. Not a day of production stopped. Chobi Mela went on, the building went up, and this building has now become an oasis of free speech within Bangladesh. Of course, I didn't have a camera while I was in jail, so I decided to use other ways of telling stories. And I've worked with my niece, an architect, Sophia Karim, and her work and Naeem's work and that of Majority World photographers and others are in this Chicago show right now. So she built architectural models based on my memory of my period in jail to produce these. I had to continue work. I mean, today it's no longer safe for me to use a mobile phone in Bangladesh. I used to go around on a bicycle. I can't do that anymore. So I devised a different mechanism of working, and a mobile studio using which I take portraits of survivors of torture, and I take them through their memory as well and photograph them as they recollect those things. The Root News is again now out as part of something we're trying to set up, a Center for Investigative Journalism, but it addresses stories mainstream media does not. For instance, this is about a media magnate whose girlfriend committed suicide, and it is believed it was murder, but mainstream media refuses to touch this story. And Rick News talks about stories like these that mainstream media will not touch. This picture is very important to me. I showed you the picture of the boat earlier on. While I was recuperating in jail, in the jail hospital, my fellow prisoners came and said, "We want one of your pictures." And I smuggled in one of my books and gave it to them. As I come out of prison, the hospital, I find that they had made this 12-foot mural on the outer wall of the hospital as an homage to me. And it still is in there. And what we did while I was in jail is, apart from this, worked with the prisoners. We painted murals all across jail. And I'm going to show that to you in the next picture. Before I turn on the video, if you look at this picture, the white building is the hospital where I was in. These paintings on the wall, and it's all across jail. The fourth picture on the right is the picture that I just showed of the red sail. On the main gate of the jail, you will see these 32 feet murals, which were also painted. There's this Alpona. We set up, a musical band. We vegetable patches and a whole range of things, which were fabulous for the prisoners. What's very interesting, and I'm going to just show you, run this clip now. This clip
Right kind of environment.
It's okay.
That can influence positive mentality, enhance abilities, and broaden perspectives.
So that clip is part of a video program. Let me just show you. And this is the musical band performing inside jail. And the government has actually taken the work that we did, the musical band and everything else, and produced a promo video, which it uses to show how there's this model jail in Bangladesh. Okay, they take credit for it. I have no problems with that, but that has actually changed the lives of the prisoners in jail. And at the end of the day, that's what I'm about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alom Bhai, for the excellent talk and the slides. And I know there was so much more that you could have also shared with us. The time limits prevented some of that. And hopefully some of that we'll be able to touch on during the discussion. So what we're going to do is I have a few questions for Shahidul Alam that I will share just to get the conversation going. But I request participants to start sending questions through the chat window. And as questions come up on the chat, I'll divert from my questions to yours. So the sooner you start sending your questions, then the sooner we can give those to Shahidul Alam. I'll start with one question, Alam Bhai, that came to my mind as I was watching the end of the presentation. It's a long arc of work, starting in the 1990s, continuing now and then onwards. with both your own work and with institutions that you've established, especially DRIC and Pathshala, which, as you said, many of those people who've gone through those programs are now key people working in the photography scene. But there's a way that, of course, the events of 2017-18, you being in prison for 107 days and the ongoing cases that don't seem to end, has become something that we have to talk about because it's an ongoing issue that you're having to deal with. And one of the things that we see in the presentation, it actually is there even in the 1990s, when you are making very critical photographs of the Ershad government, and then you're at the wedding of somebody who's very close to the Ershad government. And I was always struck by the fact that they didn't ask you to leave the wedding. They didn't perhaps know who you were, or perhaps didn't think you would take a photograph that might affect them. There's another photograph from that period which you didn't show, which is you photographed Arom, the store. And there was a meaning in that photograph of this very luxury good consumption. And it was in some ways critical of the Arom model. That's how I thought of it. You know, and then you have these photographs where you see, you know, the minister at the time has come to a DRIC event, the president comes and inaugurates Chobi Mela. You have the two leaders of opposition, you know, people very much in government at a young age, and then they move up the ranks, and they've all worked with you. And yet these contradictions somehow don't seem to stop people. I mean, you mentioned that you obviously work with them, and therefore the idea that you're constantly critical is not, there's no evidence for it. But people forget those things. And that last image you showed is kind of some example of the juxtaposition. You know, the reason your photograph is one of those murals is because you were in prison at the time. That's how they saw that photograph of yours, and that's how they decided to commemorate it. Yet it can very smoothly be part of a video with a nice soundtrack and an English voiceover. I'm not sure why it's in English exactly. I wonder who the audience is, but an English voiceover that is talking about, you know, the prison as a sort of warm, rehabilitative experience. I just wonder if you could reflect on these contradictions. You can do all the work you do. You can be consistent, and you've been consistent, and yet parts of your record disappear when it's convenient to focus on something else instead, and to create a caricature in some ways. That has happened in the Bangladesh media for sure.
Thank you, Naeem. I mean, very pertinent point. I mean, one of the concerns we all have is how our work may and does get appropriated and used in many ways in which it was not intended. I mean, the boat picture is actually significant in a different sense, because the boat is the symbol of Army League. And I've actually seen that boat picture in Army League posters, in their campaign posters, of course, without crediting me or paying me or any of those sort of things. But those are things that do happen. Now, I'm very pragmatic about these things. At the end of the day, I want results. I mean, I'm not married to photography. And while I'm a photographer, I chose to take on photography because it works. If tomorrow it ceases to work, I'll have no problems giving it up, picking up something else. And I will continue to resist through whatever means available. And working with the government sometimes may be part of that. And one of the things I also do is I worry about the fact that we see ourselves as marginalized people. I think we are mainstream, and we need to redefine ourselves and our position. And the minute we accept that we are marginalized people, we've accepted the way they've defined us. And I think that for us to be effective, we need to be on that top table. We need to be part of the decision-making process. And I do that through the work, or at least try to do that through the work. Sometimes it doesn't quite work out. You end up in jail, and you come out and you continue to resist, and you work in multiple ways. But I think one of the reasons I'm able to get away with what I do is also because I have a much broader acceptance than someone else might have. And I think that is part of my survival strategy as well. I think had I been lesser known, I might well have disappeared forever and not been talking to you today. But having said that, I think the fact that when I was being picked up, the fact that I resisted, I screamed, I deliberately delayed the abduction was also part of the reason why I could not have been quietly taken away. Now, this leads to other things. I mean, you mentioned that I am part of a bigger entity, which is very true. I mean, a lot of attention has been on my incarceration. People forget that there were people outside who played a very, very important role. People like yourselves, but my immediate family. And for me, what was very important was once I was arrested, they did not do what happens when other people get picked up often. They plead to the prime minister, they beg forgiveness, they plead to her largesse, and she in her magnanimity forgives them. That was not a position we took. We could have accepted the deal of coming out and say quiet. That was not a position we took. And taking that position puts you in a position of vulnerability, but also gives you a credibility, both with your own community and by the people who pick you up, because they know that they cannot get away with it. And I think ensuring that you retain that position is part of that struggle.
Thank you. I have many more questions, but I'm going to alternate to a question that came in through the chat window, also as a way to encourage others to put in their question. So this is a question from Chirodeep. And before reading it, I'll just say that I think is based on perhaps Chirodeep's understanding that you're at home right now, which I know you're not in Bangladesh right now. But here's the question. Chirodeep asked, Mr. Alam, I see the photograph on the wall behind you. It is Flip Shulke's photograph of Muhammad Ali. I am curious about why that hangs and what it means to you.
Yeah, I'm in the home of a friend, Salma Hassan Ali, who has been involved. We've worked together on many things for a long time. This is Hassan Zaid's room that I'm staying in, and that picture is Zaid's poster of Muhammad Ali. But it's very pertinent, and Muhammad Ali is a huge inspiration to many of us. And the fact that he questioned Vietnam War, he was able to give up his title and affect his career because he believed in the opposition to war. His relationship with the Black movement and many of the things that happened, I think, are also ways in which we can use our visibility, our power, our engagement to that effect. I mean, at the end of the day, Muhammad Ali was the greatest boxer and perhaps the greatest athlete of all time. For me, it's far more important that he used that position to fight for rights which others might not have been in a position to do.
Thank you, Chirodeep, for the question. I'm going to just share quickly a screen just to bring in the passage of time and how works change. So this is an interview I had done, Alam bhai, with you in 1998 for Samar magazine, a print magazine that doesn't exist anymore. It was South Asian magazine for action and reflection. The editorial board was Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, but it was based in New York. And it was prior to the full rise of the BJP and to what the BJP has become today, but already with the worry about Hindutva in India and the worry about a certain kind of Islamic militancy in Bangladesh and Pakistan that animated the group. So that kind of coalition building, which I think was possible in a way in the 1990s, which isn't possible today because of a changed scenario. The magazine came out of that. Myself and Aniruddha Das, may remember him, neuroscientist, interviewed you. And at that time, the network of South Asian photographers overseas that exists today didn't exist. So we were also talking within that context. And I was looking at the interview again today, and one of the things I was struck by is that at that time, we really focused on some of the technological aspects that BRIC was very involved in. Email and internet, but primarily email was something we focused on in this interview. And what it reminded me of, and I don't know if it's because of your PhD in chemistry or other kinds of orientation, but BRIC and Pathshala and yourself have always been very sort of technology first and early adopters. And email was one of those innovations. I remember my father was one of the early subscribers, actually, like first round of 20. And yet, as we know, email didn't end up being something that Drake continued forever. At some point, other players came in, etc. So I wonder about this thing about, you're trying out many things. You're being introduced to new technologies. Drake was very early to take on digital photography. At some point, the primary darkroom couldn't be maintained the same way. And I wonder about this journey with technology, whether you could think with us a little bit about when things didn't work out when you expected them to, right? Because I remember rereading this and thinking, the analog is almost when the first early email providers, America Online, which used to mail out CD-ROM, which, was dominant for a while and then not. Drake was very early to this, but I wonder what happened with that technology broadly. I'm not asking necessarily a question about email, but broadly, Drake and your journey alongside new technology.
Well, technology is there to stay. I think we would be foolish to ignore it, and it will be used and abused by whoever happens to do it. I mean, Elon Musk buys Twitter and then takes it in different directions. So that is what's going to happen. It's up to us to decide how we intervene in that space. Not only, I mean, we're not a technology company. We set up internet, email at that time because no one else was doing it, and we felt it was needed. And it allowed us to do things we might not otherwise have done. Once others started doing it and they do it better than we do, I'm perfectly happy to leave it up to them. In fact, even with photography, I mean, I was very discouraged from setting up Pathshala because my friends were saying that we would set up competitors to ourselves. Yes, of course. But that was the point of the exercise. I mean, now there are many people outside who do very good photography who are our competitors. And I think that's good for the space. But to come back to what you're talking about, I think maintaining a critical eye towards that position remains important. And one of the articles I'd written a long time back in Bytes for All, and that was actually, Bytes for All was an initiative by Partho, who was then Drake's webmaster, working together. And by the way, you were our webmaster once upon a time. We shouldn't forget that either. But I, at that time, wrote a piece saying, when a modem costs more than a cow. And I think it is pertinent that while we use these sweeping terms like everyone's equal on the internet and there are no, it's an equal playing field, we need to recognize that it is not an equal playing field. The power structures that determine everything else determines the technology as well. And we need to be technologically savvy sufficiently to be able to intervene in that space and not let it be. So I'm not a politician, but I work in 3 areas of intervention: media, education, and culture, and then exert pressure upon the political space so politicians cannot get away with their indiscretions. And I think we will work with whatever tool happens to be appropriate at a particular time and that we have access to and we have skills towards. And I'm not married either to the technology or the art. I want the results.
I also like what you said, that if photography stops fulfilling what I do tomorrow, I'll stop doing it and do something else. You see it as a tool, but not a church and a temple, is how I understood that comment. Okay, so while we wait for more questions from the audience, I have another one, which again is related to the passage of time. And I'm just going to bring up this screen only to bring up a photograph you had already shown during the presentation, which is the image of Taslima Nasreen when she was in hiding. This is from the New Internationalist, which published it at some point, and also mentions the email network. And it becomes this photograph becomes the usila, we could say, to bring up 2 topics. One is that with the passage of time, the positions of our allies change. We are always learning new things and adapting positions, and our allies are also adapting positions. And sometimes allies may not be the same allies 20 years later. So I bring up Taslima Nasreen for that context, and it also allows us to talk about 2 complicated aspects specific to South Asia. One is the role of India as the dominant big brother in the region. You call them the United States of South Asia. And I suppose in some ways, we are regarded by India as a Mexico in some ways. in some of the discourse around the border. You mentioned Felani, the woman who was shot on the border. And then the other is, of course, how we understand the question of religion. And so Taslima allows us to talk through some of that. Obviously, you were one of her allies, and you mentioned that she was in hiding in your house, and then Taslima fled the country. Eventually ended up in India, which is when I think for a lot of Bangladeshi progressives, the position of Taslima Nasreen, as she was understood, became very different from Taslima in Sweden, because in India, she started giving statements that were not particularly critical of the new dispensation that's in India right now. And people started worrying that in some ways, her comments were critical of Islam in a way that was playing into the hands of Hindutva forces. And certainly many of our allies inside India have actually been Hindutva forces now who keep her cause going, which is a very uncomfortable position for those of us who championed her right to free speech. So I wonder about that, these allies who change positions or allies whose hosts change, right? Taslima in Sweden is different from Taslima in India, and a different kind of discourse is being played out vis-a-vis Islam. And then the second thing that I want to bring in is you had also shown the image of yourself with Arundhati Roy, and as we know, she was a guest in Bangladesh in conversation with you, and even her arrival and her presentation became a big thing in Bangladesh, because at some point there was an attempt to allow her not to speak by powerful forces. We didn't get into that during the talk, but that was another aspect. So we have Taslima Nasreen as a different kind of figure living in India, and then we have Arundhati Roy as an Indian writer and activist who is also at loggerheads with the Indian state, has faced persecution. So I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about this question of the change in position of allies and how our work gets complicated by that, and also the question of Islam, on which the liberal progressive position inside Bangladesh has also changed a lot in 20 years. Your partner Rehnuma Ahmed wrote the book on Islamic thought, or an anthology of translations of Islamic thought, for which she was criticized by some progressive forces as saying, well, this is not what we should be talking about. It shows the confusion in the progressive community vis-a-vis the question of religion. And you also brought up Marina Tabassum's mosque project and the fact that your work hadn't shown in a mosque. So maybe I'll just, with that somewhat perhaps confusing constellation of threads, I'll pass it on to you just to tell us a little bit about your thoughts on allies, your question of India, the question of religion, all of those things together.
The allies are what was happening at that time. So it was a persecuted writer that I was campaigning for. It was for her right to free speech that I was campaigning for. It wasn't Taslima per se. I mean, someone else in that position I would have campaigned for in the same way. I mean, I'm an ardent advocate for the rights of Palestinians. Had the situation been reversed and Jewish people being persecuted, I would defend the rights of Jewish people in the same way. It's ironic today that I've been put in jail by Sheikh Hasina, but in fact, when Sheikh Hasina and Khaled Wazir were imprisoned by the military regime, we were campaigning for them. And this is one of the quandaries we find ourselves in. I mean, at the end of the day, you need to work based on the principles that you're about. And I think people fit in within those principles. Sometimes they come in, sometimes they go out. And as you rightly say, their position may change. I'm not, it's not Taslima Nasreen per se that I'm talking about. If Taslima Nasreen takes a position which I agree with, I will defend it. If she tomorrow does not, I will discard it. I'm talking to you today. If you take a position which I find problematic, I will question it, regardless of the fact that you're a friend and we have this long association. I think that is something we find often difficult to do. I mean, a lot of our support is tribal in a sense, and without making tribal sound like a bad thing, but where we are not critical of the position, but we align ourselves in a camp. And having done so, the camp dictates our political position and not the other way around. And that continues to be the case. You were talking about religion, for instance. I mean, another thing that I'm worried about is the fact that I've never, at least to my knowledge, I've not come across the Slima ever questioning Islamophobia, which is a huge problem as far as I'm concerned. We talk of Malalai and the adoration of Malalai by the West because she was attacked by the Taliban and rightly speaks up for women's rights. But I'm hugely concerned that while she says all those good things, she's been so uncritical of the drones that are being used to kill Muslims and others across the globe. So I think it is the politics of the position that we need to be concerned about rather than the individuals who fit in those clothes.
Thank you. We have a question from Tasneem Mehta in the chat box. The question is, Alom Bhai, what is your relationship with the rest of the art community and artists in Bangladesh? Have you been able to bring them along with you? Are they as political in their work?
This is something I'm really very concerned about. I mean, if you look at Bangladesh's heritage, I mean, artists have played such an important role throughout Bangladesh's history until recently. And today, the main artists, the architects, the writers, to a very large extent, are quiet when they need to be the most vocal. I mean, of course, there are exceptions. I mean, Mushtaq Ahmed died in jail and others have played a role, but to a very large extent, certainly the heavyweights of our industry, the artists, the scholars, the intelligentsia, have to a very large extent sold out, in my opinion. They have not played the role they need to do. I mean, I shouldn't perhaps be so self-righteous when I say this, because I recognize that the space within which we operate in is difficult. It is a fascist state. There is an environment of fear. Also, there are things, very practical things, like how state funding is given, how you receive awards or do not, and all that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, those become part of the equation. And I'm not going to be a purist and say one is to discard all that. But when you consider that Bangladesh came out of this very bloody war of liberation, the Bangladesh we dreamed about is not the Bangladesh we're in today. And I would have hoped that these artists would have remembered that and continued to play a role. The current government has actually been very smart in aligning itself with 71 and therefore created a situation where questioning them questioned 71. And through that process, they very cleverly created a binary whereby you have to make a choice between either being supportive of this repressive regime or being critical, by their definition, of the war of liberation. It's a position I'm not prepared to accept.
I have more to say about that question of positions on 1971. But first, another question from Munira M, who has asked, are you concerned with the imagery used in Western media when talking about global majority stories? Or is it enough to work locally and focus on how your own stories are told? I struggle to find photos on Reuters, Getty, etc. that represent South Asia in a way that is bottom-up or localized. And then Munira adds, BRIC images as a site no longer functions. Is there a need for this kind of infrastructure to make that accessible photographers and visuals from the global majority?
So I'll start with the question at the end about BRIC images not functioning. I mean, one of the byproducts of being in a position where the government considers you toxic is that we are constantly attacked, not just physically, but also on the cyberspace. So the BRIC images site, many of our websites, our social media sites are constantly being attacked, and we're in this never-ending tussle where we try and bring them back and they try and bring them down. So the BRIC site is not down, its access has been throttled. And we do get away with that. There are times you will find it. If you go to VPN and use other tools, you will be able to find it, but that's another story. To come back to the main question that you're asking, you see, there's a very interesting statement by Stuart Hall where he talks about a black man with a black camera will not necessarily take black pictures. And essentially, the photographs we take depends upon the politics we embrace. And the politics of Western media has not shifted. They have been asked tough questions, and they've had to respond to that. I mean, I'm here today because I was speaking yesterday at National Geographic. National Geographic itself is one of these old institutions that has had a very problematic imagery. It has presented a very problematic view of what I call the majority world. Yet I'm working with them because what I'm trying to do is to change the space that they operate within. We set up Majority World in 2004. We later had a seminar on diversity inclusion at World Press Photo. That led to an entity called Reclaim Photo being formed, which is a network of Majority World, Photo Africa, and several other agencies, which all work with the same concept of representing underrepresented photographers. And there is now a diversity summit that takes place in New York. Well, it did until COVID came along, which was doing very important work, we felt. So you push and probe at every level, but it's a never-ending one. And I don't honestly believe that the West will change because their politics has changed. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think there is such a thing called morality in international politics. There's only self-interest. And we have to fight within that space and ensure that our self-interest is something we are able to defend.
Yeah, I mean, you know this story already, maybe, that Sarkar Pratik and I collaborated on a project for National Geographic, the online version for the anniversary of partition, and Sarkar Pratik's photographs of East Bengal Railway, coupled with a really long essay I had written. And then our interactions with National Geographic, even after all these years, after all the conversations that have happened, I found it to be quite top-down, where there was not so much space to push back and say, no, this is the way the photograph should be shown, and this is how much of the text should be included. So in a way, we are critical of these platforms, and maybe we've in some ways moved on from platforms. Certainly Nat Geo is not the dominant decider of photography that it might once have been, but they still hold on to their expectations of deference, is what I found, at least in that interaction. I think Sarkar Pratik would probably share the same sentiment. We have a question from Vikar Sayyad, where he asked, and I think this is referring to some of the slides you had said, that you had shared, the fact that you're able to bring the officials onto the same platform as you, which means bringing dissenting voices together. But Vikar Sayyad asks, how can a person like me who doesn't have those kinds of resources in hand bring change with my story?
I think we all have resources in our space, in our community. We can do what we can. And I see this as a collective endeavor. But having said that, yes, you're right. I am now in a position where I can say more than I did, but this is a position that didn't happen by itself. It's a position that gets created. And I think space is space you create. And it's each person from our own position. One of the things we need to do, I mean, and this is what we did when we started up, our resources were far more limited. We didn't know very many people. We worked through collectives. And it was a collective strength that allowed us to go to the next steps. And I think we really need to be strategic and tactical at any one point. It is a battle. And if you fight a battle, you fight to win. So there are times when you will make tactical retreats. There are times when you will stay quiet and save your skin. There are other times when you will come out and shout. And the timings are important. So you can talk about what you may or may not have, but I'm sure you within your community are an important person. And that community is something that you need to give value to. And I look at it in a different way. If I, through whatever I've done, have been able to make a difference to the immediate people around me, my life has mattered. And hopefully you're able to extend that space. But if not, if you affect one person's life, that is worthwhile.
Thank you, Alam Bhai, and thank you, Vikar, for your question. I wanted to share again my screen because I wanted to bring up a topic that hasn't come up in our discussion of the multiple crises within Bangladesh, and that's of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up is because you did share the photographs of from inside the Rohingya refugee boat. And in some ways, the Rohingya crisis right now is one that, in the context of a presentation, we can show one image and make a reference, and most of the audience immediately know of what's going on with the Rohingya refugees. It's one of the crises of refugees and displacement of population that people are much more aware of because of the media role. But for a long time in Bangladesh progressive circles, including photography, including Drake, Chittagong Hill Tracts was the crisis of Bangladesh nationalism that we all struggled with. The crisis of Bangladesh becoming independent and immediately turning its oppressive apparatus onto its own internal minorities, in this case, the Adivasi communities of Chittagong Hill Tracts. And analogous to 1971, the Bangladesh government carried out a low-level insurgency control operation from the 1970s well into the 1990s when a peace accord was signed. And so the reason I bring this up, this is the anthology that a few of us have co-edited, which has a lot of connections with people coming out of Drake, which is on Chittagong Hill Tracts. And I just assembled the photography pages. So it's primarily a book of text, but each chapter starts with a photograph. And out of the 11 or 12 photographs we had, 3 are taken by you. So the photograph for the introduction, for setting the frame, both the frame of the story and the frame of the camera, and this infamous quote from a government minister, which said Bangladesh has no indigenous people. These 3 have images taken by you. And the 4th one, whose land is it anyway, is Tanvir Murad Topu, who is not only a Pathshala graduate, but has been vice principal of the place. And then I was looking through the rest of the photographs. They're also all many Pathshala graduates. Jannatul Mawa here, Momena Jalil in this one, Wasfia Nazreen, who you've worked with, and Shomari Chakma, who you've mentored as well. So there's a long connection of Greek photographers working on the Chittagong Hill Tracts issue. Yet going to the question that somebody had asked about, have you been able to bring along the local community with you? It strikes me, and I think Alam Bhai, you'll agree, that considering how large a crisis this is and how much this is not an externally generated crisis, it's not India pushing people into our country or Myanmar pushing people into Bangladesh. It's generated by the Bangladesh government and the silence of Bengali nationalism. There has actually not been that much work on Chittagong Hill Tracts. At some point when we were working on another project and we're looking for photographs of the military in Chittagong Hill Tracts, the only photograph we could find in a documentary mode was one taken by you of soldiers, and I think it's in the early 1990s. And there's now a strand of a few photographers working on this, but in a much more abstract, indirect way. It's of course a legitimate way of working on this, but not so much direct work. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how certain topics, why photographers haven't picked this up, why there is so much photography on the Rohingya refugees, but still not very much at all on Chittagong Hill Tracts. Otherwise, why would we have, we have 3 photographs by you, partially because these are beautiful classically framed photographs, partially because you are one of the few people who have photographed in Chittagong Hill Tracts. The rest of the community hasn't come along. And then also related to that, maybe this problem of how the media gaze is always moving. Like we haven't been able to keep Chittagong Hill Tracts in the media spotlight. Like the media spotlight has moved on somehow with the crisis still unresolved.
Yeah, I mean, it also has to do with Bangladeshi hegemony. I think it's a very complex story. I didn't have chance to discuss that. I mean, for instance, the Kalpana trilogy that I did in 2013, 14, and 15, where I did 3 substantial bodies of work on Kalpana Chakma. And one of the things I've tried to do through that work and elsewhere, and I'll just refer to something, go back a little bit. When I showed the work of the wedding pictures and the flood pictures, something very interesting happened. It was reviewed by a magazine called Ononna, which was edited by the wife of the minister. And I found that very strange. I mean, here's this body of work which is being shunned by everyone because of the fact that I critique this minister. Yet that magazine shows their work. But what they did was very interesting. It gave a beautiful review of talking about the artistry of my work, the quality of my black and white, the compositions, waxed lyrical about what I was doing, completely ignoring the political content. And I realized that that's how these things can often operate. I mean, artists can, you can have your little art, we'll give you a grant, we'll give you a pat on the back, we'll send you overseas and all those sort of things, we'll give you a little award. Just leave the politics out of it. And there are many people who are perfectly happy to go along with that. And I think, being very crass about it, one of the reasons so many more people work on the Rohingya situation and not so much on the Chittagong Hill Tracts is because there's funding available for the Rohingyas, but not for the Chittagong Hill Tracts. And of course, there are other issues. For instance, as soon as you go into the Chittagong Hill Tracts, you're actually talking about the military. And that's a taboo subject, so not many people are prepared to take that on. So there are all those layers, but you're absolutely right. I think we have failed to a large extent in highlighting the Chittagong Hill Tracts story sufficiently. And for me, it's incredible that a nation that fought for the right to speak its own language denies others to speak theirs within its own independent nation state. And that is something we have to accept. What we have been doing within DRIC is to try and address that by including many more people from the Chittagong Hill Tracts, from minority communities within the DRIC fold, if you like. Hopefully, they will be the people who will be able to take this on further. I don't know. I would hope Bangladeshis would also play that role, but that proof isn't there yet.
Thank you, Alam Bhai. I think we have to wrap up. And so I will turn the baton over to Latika Gupta. We could talk for much longer. There are appreciative messages coming from many people saying thank you for the event. So I think people are just taking in what you're saying and probably will think of questions later that they'll want to email you about. But thank you very much for sharing some parts of the story. And I'll just say to anyone who's encountering Shahidul Alam's work for the first time, there is a lot more work out there, and part of the work is also people he has mentored and trained always. Latika, over to you.
Naeem, could I take the liberty of asking you whether you want to take this one last question from Alina?
Oh yeah, I didn't know there was one more question. Yes.
Just came in.
Yes, Alina Tipagne asked, thank you so much for this, SSF and Shahidul. I'm curious to know the story of the girl in the front row that Shahidul said he'll revisit later.
Okay, perhaps you could go to the picture, but I don't need to. So this is a picture taken in the minister's home. Sometimes what you do is something that's not immediate. It happens later on or in ways you don't understand. I was going on a flight, an Emirates flight to Dubai, and across the aisle was this young woman sitting there, and she reached out to me to say, "You don't recognize me, do you?" Of course I didn't. She says, "I'm that fat girl in that picture," the picture I'm referring to. Now, what had happened is we had published that picture in our calendar, and we published another picture of Mizan, who used to work in my parents' home, who would clean the room where we watched television, but he would have to sit outside to watch TV. So there was this class struggle within my own home that I was pointing to. And so there were these two pictures in the calendar, one of Mizan watching television and another of this girl watching TV amongst these other kids. Now, she was very happy that her picture appeared in a calendar until she began to realize that this was actually a critical take on her and her community. And she later decided she would become, I mean, she's from a wealthy background. She decided she would take on work in the development sector. And at that time, on that flight, she was actually going to a BRAC project in Sierra Leone to begin work as a development worker. And she said that it was her inclusion in that calendar picture which struck the initial chord and raised the questions and began to she began to question herself within her community about what it was, what her opulence meant. And in that particular case, she took on a life role she might not otherwise have done. So sometimes you don't know. You do what you do, and the results may work out, may not. But in this particular case, it did. And I was just very fortunate to be sitting across her for her to be able to tell me this. Otherwise, I would not have known.
Thank you so much. Good evening. My name is Latika Gupta, and I work at the Sher-Gil Sundaram Foundation as Director Projects. On behalf of SSAF, I would first like to congratulate Prakash Bhuyan again. We're looking forward immensely to following your work over the next year or so. Profuse thanks to the jury, Shahidul Alam, jury chair, Ketaki Sheth, and Tanvi Mishra for the time and the care that you put into reviewing the applications for the documentary photography category of the 2022 Umrao Singh Sher-Gil grant. Thanks also to the applicants, many of whom are here tonight, for sharing and trusting us with their work. I'd like to mention SSAF's advisor, Devika Daulat Singh, who has been instrumental in the inception of the grant for photography, which is in fact the flagship program of the foundation. Thank you so much, Dr. Shahidul Alam, for the lecture, which addressed really urgent and pressing concerns of our contemporary condition, but also the peculiarities of location that you focused on, and to Naeem for the engaging discussion. Before we end, I'd like to introduce our colleagues at SSAF. Sher-Gil, who's in charge of visual design, media, and archives, who designed the graphics, but also handled all the technical aspects for this event. Malavika Madgulkar, Assistant Editor, Publications and Communications, and Santosh Sani, our Accounts Executive. Thank you all for joining us this evening from different parts of the world. We hope to see you again and request you to check out our website, ssaf.in, and also follow us on social media for updates about forthcoming programs. Good night.